Richard Hawthorne's office was a perfect reflection of the man himself, impeccably ordered, with every detail meticulously arranged. The polished oak desk in the center gleamed under the soft light of the glass chandelier. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on business strategy and leadership. A large window overlooked the bustling city, offering a view Richard rarely appreciated. He was too focused on the spreadsheets and contracts that filled his day. Richard sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the polished surface as he reviewed the quarterly earnings report. Numbers ruled his world, and in his mind, they told the only story that mattered: profit, efficiency, and control. His assistant, Mark, entered quietly, as he always did. "Sir, the new junior logistics coordinator is here. Amara Washington." Richard didn't look up. "Washington? Who approved this hire?" "HR, sir. She has an excellent background in logistics and supply chain management." Mark hesitated, sensing Richard's irritation. Richard finally glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Bring me her file." Mark returned moments later, handing over the folder. Richard flipped through it, his eyes scanning her qualifications. Top of her class, strong recommendations, and practical experience from an internship at a respected firm. On paper, she was perfect, yet something gnawed at him. "Where is she?" Richard asked abruptly. "She's in the main office, meeting the team," Mark replied. Without a word, Richard stood and made his way to the main office. The open plan space was abuzz with activity, but all movement ceased when Richard appeared. His presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Amara was at her desk, organizing her supplies. She looked up as Richard approached, her smile warm and genuine. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, extending her hand. Richard didn't take it. His eyes scanned her face, then moved to her hand before meeting her gaze again. His expression remained cold. "Follow me," he said curtly. Amara's heart sank, but she followed him into his office. The door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing them in a heavy silence. Richard moved behind his desk, motioning for her to sit. She did, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "I'm going to be direct," Richard began, his tone devoid of emotion. "Your presence here is not in alignment with the vision I have for this company." Amara blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't understand. I've just started." "That's irrelevant," he interrupted. "You're not a fit." "But I've met all the qualifications," she argued, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her chest. "I earned this position." Richard leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to justify my decisions. Pack your things and leave." The finality in his voice struck her like a blow. Amara felt anger rise, but she swallowed it. She knew better than to let him see her break. Rising slowly, she nodded. "Thank you for your time," she said. Her voice calm though her heart was heavy. As she walked out of his office, the weight of disappointment pressed down on her. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues, their shock mirroring her own. She gathered her belongings in silence, refusing to shed tears. The door closed behind her, but the memory of her departure lingered like a shadow. Richard sat back in his chair, staring at the door. His face was impassive, but something inside him stirred, a faint discomfort he couldn't quite place. He shook it off and returned to his reports. In the quiet of the evening, Amara found herself at St. Benedict's Church. The familiar scent of old wood and candle wax greeted her, offering a solace she desperately needed. She sank into a pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Father Emmanuel, a tall, slender man with kind eyes and silver hair, noticed her immediately. He had known Amara since she was a child, watching her grow into a determined young woman. He approached quietly, sitting beside her. "Amara, what troubles you?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "I lost my job, Father. I wasn't even given a chance." Her voice cracked, and she wiped her eyes quickly. Father Emmanuel listened, as she recounted the day's events. His expression hardened slightly when she mentioned Richard Hawthorne's name, but he remained calm. "You were wronged," he said finally. "But this is not the end of your story. Sometimes, those who wield power forget the responsibility that comes with it." "I don't know how to move forward," Amara admitted. "You will," he assured her. "For now, rest in the knowledge that you are not alone. There is always justice, even if it comes slowly." Amara nodded, her heart a little lighter. As she left the church, Father Emmanuel remained seated, deep in thought. He had seen too much injustice in his time to ignore this. Richard Hawthorne needed to be reminded that power without compassion was a dangerous path, and Father Emmanuel intended to deliver that lesson himself. As the church's bells tolled softly in the distance, a plan began to form in the priest's mind, one that would bring Richard face to face with the consequences of his actions. Monday morning arrived with a dense fog blanketing the city. Richard Hawthorne pulled into his reserved parking space, oblivious to the gray haze. He had already mentally mapped out his day. Review quarterly reports, finalize the new client contract, and handle a few personnel matters. The incident with Amara Washington barely registered in his mind anymore. She was gone, and to him, that was the end of it. Inside, the office atmosphere was unusually tense. Richard, absorbed in his routine, didn't notice the whispered conversations or the quick glances exchanged as he passed by. His staff moved with uncharacteristic stiffness, but he dismissed it as typical Monday sluggishness. As he settled at his desk, there was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he barked without looking up. To his surprise, it was Mark, his assistant, looking more anxious than usual. "Sir, there's a visitor here to see you," Mark said hesitantly. "I don't have any appointments this morning," Richard replied, his eyes narrowing. "It's Father Emmanuel from St. Benedict's Church. He says it's important." Richard leaned back in his chair, surprised but intrigued. His connection to the church was superficial. A few donations here and there, attendance at the occasional service to maintain his image. He had met Father Emmanuel a handful of times, but had never exchanged more than pleasantries. After a brief pause, he nodded. "Send him in." Father Emmanuel entered, his presence calm yet commanding. He wore a simple black cassock, his silver hair gleaming in the office's bright light. Richard gestured to the chair across from him. "Father, this is unexpected. What brings you here?" Father Emmanuel smiled politely but didn't sit. Instead, he stood tall, his hands clasped in front of him. "I appreciate you seeing me on short notice, Mr. Hawthorne. I won't take much of your time." Richard nodded, though he was already calculating how quickly he could end this meeting. "Go on." Father Emmanuel's expression grew serious. "I've come to talk to you about a grave matter, one concerning Amara Washington." Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone measured. "Father, I don't see how that's your concern." "It's my concern because I'm responsible for the spiritual well-being of this community, including Amara," Father Emmanuel said firmly. "When one of my parishioners is wronged, it's my duty to address it." Richard's eyes flashed with irritation. "I made a business decision. It wasn't personal." "Ah, but all decisions are personal when they affect lives," Father Emmanuel countered. Amara was dismissed not because of her performance, but because of something far less tangible, something rooted in bias. Richard stood abruptly. "I think you've overstepped, Father. This is my company. I make decisions that are best for it." Father Emmanuel remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "And I'm here to remind you that your decisions have consequences beyond profit margins. You may control this company, but you do not control the human spirit. You've wounded Amara's spirit, and that wound echoes throughout this community." Richard stared at him, his fists clenched. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the distant hum of office activity. "I'm not here to accuse you," Father Emmanuel continued, his voice softening. "I'm here to offer you a chance to reflect, to understand that power without compassion leads to ruin, not just for others, but for yourself." Richard's defenses were firmly in place. But deep down, something about the priest's words unsettled him. He masked it with a tight smile. "Thank you for your concern, Father. But I believe this is a matter for me and my company to handle." Father Emmanuel nodded slowly. "As you wish. But remember this. True strength lies in humility. When you close yourself off to others, you build walls that imprison you as much as they keep others out." Without waiting for a response, Father Emmanuel turned and left, his steps measured and deliberate. Richard remained standing, his thoughts racing. For the rest of the day, Richard was distracted. Father Emmanuel's words lingered, replaying in his mind. He tried to dismiss them, focusing on the task at hand, but something gnawed at him, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. That evening, he sat in his office long after everyone else had left. The city lights twinkled outside his window, but they offered no comfort. He stared out into the night, his reflection staring back at him. For the first time in years, Richard felt doubt creeping in. Meanwhile, at St. Benedict's, Father Emmanuel knelt in silent prayer. He knew his words had planted a seed, but whether it would grow was up to Richard. Justice often came slowly, but Father Emmanuel had faith that it would come. Sometimes, the hardest hearts could still be softened. Richard Hawthorne woke the next morning after a restless night. His mind, usually sharp and focused, was clouded with unease. Father Emmanuel's words lingered like an unwelcome guest, refusing to be dismissed. He brushed it off as unnecessary sentiment, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. Arriving at the office earlier than usual, Richard intended to throw himself into his work and silence the growing voice of doubt. Yet, as he walked through the door, something felt different. The usual hum of activity was quieter, subdued. He noticed the way his employees avoided eye contact, whispering among themselves when they thought he wasn't looking. At his desk, he found a small envelope resting on top of his daily reports. It was plain, with no markings. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter in neat cursive. "Mr. Hawthorne, you may not remember me, but I was once in your position, powerful, respected, and convinced I was right. I, too, made decisions that hurt others, believing they were for the greater good. Until one day, someone showed me the human cost of my actions. I realized then that power without empathy leads to destruction. I hope you'll take this opportunity to reflect, as I once did. Sometimes, redemption comes not through grand gestures, but in small, courageous acts of change. A friend." Richard read the letter twice, his brow furrowed. He didn't recognize the handwriting or the sender. A part of him wanted to crumple it up and toss it in the trash, but something stopped him. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his desk drawer. Despite his best efforts, the letter gnawed at him throughout the day. Meetings passed in a blur, numbers and reports blending into a meaningless haze. By lunchtime, Richard found himself pacing his office. The walls seemed to close in, the usual sense of control slipping from his grasp. Unable to concentrate, he decided to take a walk. The crisp winter air outside was a welcome change from the oppressive atmosphere inside. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts swirling. Without realizing it, he found himself standing in front of St. Benedict's Church. He hesitated. The logical part of him told him to turn around, to go back to the office and regain control. But another part, a quieter, unfamiliar part, urged him to step inside. Before he could second-guess himself, he pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The church was quiet, the soft light filtering through the stained glass, casting colorful patterns on the stone floor. Richard stood in the entrance, feeling out of place, yet strangely drawn in. "Mr. Hawthorne," came a familiar voice. Richard turned to see Father Emmanuel approaching, his expression warm but knowing. "I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here," Richard admitted, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. Father Emmanuel gestured to a nearby pew. "Walk with me?" Reluctantly, Richard nodded. They walked slowly down the aisle, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Father Emmanuel spoke. Something brought you here today. Perhaps you're beginning to question things. Richard exhaled sharply. You make it sound like I'm having a crisis of faith. I'm not. No. Father Emmanuel stopped, turning to face him. Then why are you here? Richard hesitated, his defenses faltering. I don't know, he admitted, but ever since you spoke to me, and after everything that's happened, I can't shake this feeling that maybe I got it wrong. Maybe I've been getting a lot of things wrong. Father Emmanuel's eyes softened. Admitting doubt is a first step toward wisdom, Richard. You've spent your life chasing success, but at what cost? Have you ever stopped to consider the people left in your wake? I didn't think it mattered, Richard said quietly. Business is business. Business is built on people, Father Emmanuel countered. Without them, success is hollow. Richard fell silent, absorbing the priest's words. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the weight of his actions, not just with Amara, but with countless others over the years. He had always dismissed his decisions as necessary, but now he wasn't so sure. Father, Richard began hesitantly, what if I've done too much damage? What if it's too late to change? Father Emmanuel placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. It's never too late. The first step is recognizing the harm you've caused. The next is seeking to make it right. Not for your own redemption, but because it's the right thing to do. Richard swallowed hard. He hadn't expected to feel this vulnerable. But something about Father Emmanuel's presence made it easier to lower his guard. I don't know where to start, Richard admitted. You start by listening, Father Emmanuel said gently. Listen to those you've wronged. Hear their stories. Let their experiences reshape your perspective. And then act with humility. The words settled deep within Richard, igniting a spark of resolve. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to try. I'll think about it, he said finally. Father Emmanuel nodded. That's all I ask. The rest will follow. As Richard left the church, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about numbers or control. He was thinking about people, and that he realized was a start. 2 weeks passed, and in that time, Richard Hawthorne underwent a quiet but profound transformation. The seed of doubt planted by Father Emmanuel had taken root, growing into a need for change. He spent long hours reflecting on his past decisions, his treatment of others, and the emptiness he felt despite his success. One morning, Richard stood before the large windows in his office, watching the city stir to life. The familiar view now looked different, less like a kingdom he ruled and more like a community he had distanced himself from. He knew it was time to act. He called Mark into his office. Mark, I want to organize a company-wide meeting, Richard said, his tone firm but calm. Mark's eyebrows raised in surprise. A meeting? For what purpose? I have something important to say to everyone. Schedule it for this afternoon. Mark nodded, still confused but sensing something significant. I'll arrange it. That afternoon, the entire staff gathered in the large conference room. The atmosphere buzzed with curiosity and uncertainty. Richard stood at the front, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He cleared his throat, his heart pounding, but his resolve was steady. Thank you all for coming, he began. I've asked you here today because I need to address something important, something I've neglected for far too long. The room fell silent. I've made decisions in this company based on efficiency and profit, often without considering the human cost. Recently, I've been forced to confront the impact of those decisions, especially after what happened with Amara Washington. He paused, glancing around the room. I treated her unfairly, and in doing so, I showed a lack of respect not just for her, but for everyone here who works tirelessly to make this company succeed. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard took a deep breath. I'm here today to apologize, not just to Amara, but to all of you. I let power and ambition blind me to the value of compassion and empathy. I want to change that. His voice softened. From now on, this company will be built on more than just numbers. It will be built on people. Your voices matter, and I intend to listen." For a moment, there was silence. Then, someone began clapping. Slowly, others joined in until the entire room was filled with applause. Richard felt a wave of emotion he hadn't expected, a sense of connection and purpose he hadn't felt in years. After the meeting, Richard returned to his office, where Mark stood waiting. "That was unexpected," Mark said with a small smile. "But it was the right thing to do." Richard nodded. "It's just the beginning." The next day, Richard personally reached out to Amara. She was hesitant at first, unsure of his intentions, but agreed to meet him at a local coffee shop. When she arrived, she was surprised to find him waiting with a genuine, apologetic expression. "Amara," he began, standing as she approached, "thank you for meeting with me. I owe you an apology." She folded her arms, wary. "Why now?" "Because I was wrong," Richard admitted, his voice steady but sincere. "I let my biases and ego dictate my decisions, and it cost you your job and dignity. I can't undo what happened, but I want to make it right." Amara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of pretense. Slowly, she sat down. "I'm listening." Richard leaned forward. "I want to offer you your position back, on your terms. More importantly, I want your help in reshaping the culture of our company. We need to be better, and I can't do it alone." Amara was silent, her emotions swirling. She had been hurt, but she also saw something she hadn't expected in Richard: humility. Finally, she nodded. "I'll consider it, but only if I see real change." "You will," Richard promised. In the weeks that followed, Richard and Amara worked together to implement new policies that prioritized diversity, inclusion, and fairness. Employee feedback sessions became regular occurrences, and a mentorship program was launched to support underrepresented groups within the company. Slowly, the company culture began to shift. One afternoon, Amara stood beside Richard as they addressed the staff once again. This time, the atmosphere was different, lighter, more hopeful. Richard turned to Amara and smiled. "Thank you for believing in change," he said quietly. She nodded. "Thank you for being willing to change." As the room filled with applause once more, Richard realized something profound. True leadership wasn't about control. It was about serving others, lifting them up, and creating a space where everyone could thrive. And in that moment, Richard Hawthorne felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He had finally found the balance between success and humanity, and in doing so, he had reclaimed not only his company but also his soul. Moral of the story: true power lies not in domination but in compassion. When we open our hearts to empathy and listen to those we've wronged, we begin the journey toward healing and justice. No matter how far we stray, it is never too late to choose humility, seek forgiveness, and make amends.